So I just started reading again in 2022, and I went from reading a few books to a year to about 24 books this year in 2023. And I'm here to talk to you all about that. Not all 24 of the books that I read, but a few highlights of them. So if you're new here, my name is Indy. I am known as Dudes by Indy on Instagram and TikTok. Okay, so as a girly just trying to get back into reading, obviously I went to Book Talk to see what are some of the highest rated, most recommended books out there, and a lot of you have mentioned Colleen Hoover, which is a controversial author out there, but I did end up reading some of her books, some being Verity, It Ends With Us, It Starts With Us, November 8th, and then two of the books that I will be recapping today because I read in early 2023. So like I said earlier, this year I really wanted to expand the different genres that I was reading. So I'm going to be categorizing and recapping based off of the genres that I read this year, starting off with romance. Like I said before, I was reading some Colleen Hoover books early in the year. Those were the last two that I decided to read just because it was so highly recommended that I'm like, I might as well read it. So the first one being Ugly Love. So it's about this med student that's staying over her brother's apartment. He's a pilot, and then she ends up meeting his friend and neighbor who is also a pilot. They end up having like a friends with benefits kind of situation because both of them don't have time to be in a relationship because, yeah, she's a med student, he's a pilot, they never have time to be together, so it all works out. And it did work out for a while, but obviously in these kind of situations, someone's bound to fall in love with one another, and that's exactly what happened here. However, the plot twist is that he doesn't want to be in a relationship. Shocker. Men not wanting to commit to a woman. But the plot twist here is actually the reasoning behind it is because he had like a traumatic experience when he was a teenager of falling in love for the first time, and it was to his stepsister. I know it's kind of gross, and I think that's why this author is so controversial because she has these kind of themes in her story, and I did not expect this to happen, to be honest. So I think one thing that Colleen Hoover does well is having these kind of like storylines that just makes you want to keep reading. But anyways, the traumatic story is that he falls in love with the stepsister, and obviously they met before their parents got together. But even when the parents moved in, they still continue their relationship, and she ends up getting pregnant. And then she gives birth to the child, and while they were driving home, I can't remember what happened, but they were driving, and then he ends up driving over a bridge and into the water, and the baby drowns and dies, and then she blames him, and so they broke up. She's like, I can't even face you right now for killing our child. And so after that, he's like, I'm never falling in love again. So the whole book kind of surrounds this relationship of like this girl trying to make him fall in love with her, and is like, you need to get over your traumatic past, and I can change you, that kind of theme. Like I said, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but like I said, I think it was very addicting to read, to see what happens, like do they end up together? But yeah, it was just annoying because as females, like you don't want to like change a guy. So I gave this book a 3. Okay, so the next book is Reminders of Him. It's about a woman who is incarcerated, and she had a baby before being behind bars with this guy who is dead. And the reason why she's in prison or jail is because she was in a car accident with the boyfriend, the baby's dad, and she left the scene because she tried to find a pulse on the guy, but I guess he didn't have one, so she thought he was dead. So she ran out of there. I think she like was so shocked with the situation that she just went home and fell asleep. Turns out he wasn't dead. He died later in the hospital, but he was just in the car alive. I guess he had like a very faint pulse. That's why she couldn't find it. And then so the parents who now have the baby, or is taking care of the baby while she's in jail, they blame her for their son's death. The whole book is kind of about how she is trying to prove to her in-laws and this guy who is kind of like the godfather of the daughter to say like, hey, I deserve to see my daughter. I've changed. Like, I didn't kill your son, and all of that. So I don't have that much to say about this book because it was very straightforward on like what was happening. But I would say that this book is a lot less problematic than Colleen Hoover's other books. So I would give this probably a 4. Okay, so after reading all of Colleen Hoover, I decided that I'm not going to read her anymore, and so I went on Goodreads to see what I should read next, and they recommended me to read Dial A for Aunties, and then the second book, For Aunties and a Wedding. And these books were very fun to read. They're very relatable if you have a very big family who has a lot of personality and you're very close to, I would say. So the first book, Dial A for Aunties, it follows an Asian American girl named Melanie, and she accidentally kills this guy that she was on a date with, and her 4 aunties try to help cover it up. And they do this all while being at a wedding. So the backstory is that Melanie and her 4 aunties and her mom, they run like a catering wedding service situation. Like, one aunt does photography, one does catering, one does set design. So they're all in like a family business together. While at the wedding, they bring this guy because they're like, we can't leave this guy in our house. Like, we have to bring him along with us in case the police finds him. So they stuff him in the freezer, and they literally carry the freezer around this like hotel where the wedding is at. And while we're at the wedding, Melanie finds her ex-boyfriend who they broke up, and I can't remember the reason why, but like it was like they were still in love, and so it was very awkward for Melanie to be there while trying to hide the secret that she killed somebody. Oh, and the ex-boyfriend owns the hotel that they're hosting the wedding in. So I feel like this book has a little bit of romance, a little bit of comedy, some thriller. The second book, For Aunties, and it covers Melanie's own wedding. And instead of the aunties being the wedding planner, caterer, photographer, they hired their cousins, who apparently is in a gang. And so they are trying to mess up this wedding, and so the 4 aunties try to like fight them off somehow, and like, I don't know, there was like threats of people killing each other, so they're trying to like deal with all that and a wedding. All in all, I thought these 2 books were very fun to read. They're a comedic book, while having some thrill in it, some mystery in it. It's a book of anything that can happen will happen, but it all works out at the end of the day. So that's what I love about it. Okay, so the next set of books that I was recommended to read was The Deal. So I only read The Deal because my friend suggested I read it, but I do plan on reading the other books at a later time, just because I actually really did like the first book. So the first book, The Deal, follows a girl who is not that popular, but she's really smart, and she ends up liking this like soccer player, but she knows that she can never get with him because he's like super popular and she's not. So there's this guy who is a football player who happens to need help with improving his GPA, otherwise he wouldn't be able to play football. So he like literally begs the main character girl to help him, study with him, tutor him, just so that he could play football again. And so in return, he would help her get the guy of her dreams. So it's a very cliche book, but it's also one of the more realistic romance books. Obviously, she takes the deal, and obviously they fall in love, and so the whole book is just them kind of navigating, like, oh, do I like you, do I not? And there's a plot twist at the end, which I will not share because you might read it. Like I said, I like this book the most because it is the most realistic of them all. Romance books I read are very dramatized, so it was a nice change of pace to have a more realistic romance book. So I gave this book a 4. So another set of books that I read, which was very popular on Book Talk, was Archer, and then the second book was Travis, which I have here. I borrowed Archer from the library, that's why I don't have it, but I feel like Archer did not disappoint. It was very good. It was about a girl, her name is Bree, and she goes through something very traumatic, so she decides that I'm going to run away from my problems, and she moves to another town. And this is the type of town that everybody knows one another and everyone's business. So she goes in this town, and then she talks to everybody, but there's this one guy named Archer who is giving her like the side eye, the shoulder, doesn't talk to her ever. And it was for good reason because he actually can't even talk in general. He went through something as a kid where he injured his throat, which they'll give you a backstory for. Oh, and because he can't like speak, everyone in town like talks about Archer being like, oh, he's like secluding himself in the forest instead of living in the town with everybody. But Bree obviously is like, I'm going to talk to this guy, I'm gonna like befriend him, and Bree coincidentally knows sign language because her dad was deaf. A traumatic experience for her was her dad ends up dying from like someone shooting him. So that's why she ran away from home and is now in this town. I think it's called Pelican. Okay. So, and because Bree is the only person that really talks to Archer, we learn a lot about Archer and his backstory, and then obviously they fall in love because Bree is the only one who talks to Archer, and I feel like Archer, because he can't really talk, he's a good listener. And he and Bree just kind of connected. And so I feel like this whole book was kind of like a Christmas Lifetime movie because there's no way, realistically, a newcomer goes into town and finds out all about the details of everybody in town. So at the end, there's something that happens, which again, I will not share these twists, but it left me physically gasping, and I literally shut the book because I've never had a book that made me so shook before. So I'm gonna end that recap for Archer there. The second book, Travis, it was a little bit slower for me, maybe because I haven't read Archer in a while since reading Travis. I recently read Travis because I think it just came out. But Travis is actually Archer's stepbrother, and he actually tried to hook up with Bree. He's known as a player in town, basically. So this whole book is his redemption story, and he's supposed to find love. So definitely I think this book, Travis, was a lot slower than me in the first book, so I would definitely rate it a little bit lower. I think I would rate it like a 2, I think. But then Archer was a 5 for me. Okay, so the next series, which now that I'm thinking about it, I actually read a lot of series this year, but the next series is the Twisted series. It follows 4 girls, and each girl has their own dedicated book and how they fall in love with a certain guy. And all the books are kind of connected, but at the same time, you can read it as a standalone book. But there are like snippets and cameos of like previous characters that happened in like the first and second book being in like the third and fourth book, and like they're just all over the place just because they're all like girlfriends. So it does make sense that they show up in each other's books. Overall, I feel like all four books have kind of very similar storylines. It's about like usually, I think two of the guys were like billionaires. One of them is a security guard for a princess, and then the other one is just a doctor, and they all fall in love with the girl, and then they do something stupid to like mess it all up, and then the whole book is them kind of just groveling to get the girl back, which is very similar to real life. And then there's just a lot of like smutty scenes for each of the book, except for the last book. It was definitely a slow burn. I think I remember reading like 300 or 400 pages of like just not even hand holding, like kiss with less than 100 pages left. So that one was definitely a lot slower. But the other books have a lot of smut in it if you're into that. So after finishing the Twisted series, I went into and got the King of Wrath, and that series, I didn't get the other books, but I read the first one of the King of Wrath because I did like the Twisted series. I felt like it was very similar to the Twisted series, except it was just a different kind of character. It was still a billionaire and everything, but like it was the same kind of storyline. So I was like, I'm not gonna read the other three books. But maybe when I'm in like a book slump, maybe I'll pick up the other three books. I think actually the author Anna Huang is still writing the last few books, so I'll wait until those come out. But one of the characters in King of Wrath actually does show up in the Twisted series, so they are all connected. So once you read one, you may have to read like 10 books. So I think for the Twisted series, I would give it maybe like a 4, and then the King of Wrath, I would give it closer to a 2, just because it was very similar. So the next series is Summer I Turn Pretty, because this whole summer was Summer I Turn Pretty craze. I feel like when the show first came out last year, like I wasn't that like interested in watching. I finished it, but I wasn't like this year where I was waiting week after week for the show to come out. Like I think I watched it before it even came out, because I think for Prime users you can watch on Thursdays at like 7 or something instead of waiting on Friday, which everyone else gets to watch, like something like that. But I watched it like early, and then I would watch TikToks about it. So instead of like being so anxious for the episodes to come out, I decided I'm just gonna read the books and see what happens. And I remember going to the library and trying to find this book, and it was in the young adult section, which is basically the kids section of my library. It was kind of embarrassing to be there. I don't know why. Just because I'm like the late 20s now and I didn't belong there. And so the book basically is about this girl who goes to the beach house with her brother and 2 other guys and like their moms every summer since they were kids. And one day, I think it was her 16th birthday, she is quote unquote pretty. Because she no longer has braces, no glasses anymore, and then the brothers found her really pretty, and so they started fighting over her, and that's the whole 3 series basically. But I felt like the books were very annoying to read because I felt like there was just a lot of flip-floppy with the past and the present, so it was kind of annoying to like read like that. I wish it was just like talking about the present, you know. So I think this is the first time I would say I prefer the show more than the books. So my rating for this series was probably a 2. Done with the romance of the year, we're finally moving on to fantasy. My first time ever reading fantasy, and a lot of you have suggested to read, oh my god, I'm trying to like hold it all, the ACOTAR series, and they are a hefty bunch. I think a bunch of them are like 700 pages, with the exception of this one. This one was, I think, like 300 pages, and it's kind of like a Christmas special. Everyone says to skip it, and I agree. Just kidding. I think there's some important information that helps with the fifth book. I feel like with the ACOTAR series, I can make a whole video about it because there's just so much information, but I will try my best to concise it down to a very short recap. So it's about this human named Farah, and she ends up going into the fairy world because she ends up killing a fairy that was disguised as a wolf. And the reason that she killed the wolf is because her family is poor and she's the only person in the family who can hunt and provide for the family. So she ends up killing a fairy that's disguised as a wolf, and so a fairy came from the fairy world and takes her basically as a punishment for killing a fairy. This book covers Farah kind of adjusting to her new life in this fairy world, and she falls in love with her captor. His name is Tamlin, and he is the High Lord of the Spring Court in which they are living in. There's like Spring Court, Winter Court, Summer Court, and all these different areas within the fairy world that is like, I guess a High Lord is kind of like a mayor of the town, and that's who Tamlin is. So later in the book, her captor, Tamlin, gets captured by this lady, Amarantha, and I honestly can't remember what her title is, but she's like up there. She's not the president. I guess she's more of like a vice president because she's more than a high lord, but she's not like up there. She's not the leader of the world. And she loves Tamlin, and she like had a deal with him, basically, of like, if you can't find a human to fall in love with you in X amount of years, then you're gonna have to come back here and you're basically mine. And so Farah finds out about this deal, so she goes up where Amarantha is under the mountain, and she has to go through a bunch of obstacles and challenges to kind of win Tamlin back, because she ends up actually falling for Tamlin. So she ends up almost dying from these obstacle courses and like challenges. But then I think like right when she was about to die, all the High Lords that were also there watching the games happen, they decide, we're going to give you some of our powers, because each High Lord has a different kind of power, and those powers ended up saving her life, and the person that was like, let's give her our powers, everybody, it wasn't Tamlin, it was this other guy named Reese, who is the Night Court High Lord. And he's important in the other books because he is actually the mate of Farah, which is basically a soulmate. And in the fairy world, when you're a mate with someone, like, you're with that person forever. So the next few books are about Farah and Reese and them falling together, and Tamlin being, the jealous ex-boyfriend. He's very controlling in the second book, and that's how Reese won over Farah. And then there's a bunch of wars that are happening within the fairyland, and then with the human land, and we then get other POVs. I think the fifth book, The Court of Mist and Fury, that's when we finally get a different POV that's not Farah or Reese. It's the point of view of Farah's sister. Her name is Nesta. And I think like with the next books that the author is going to write, it's going to be different POVs. I think we're done with Farah. And then a bunch of probably wars happening after that, because I feel like we're not done with fighting. So I think overall this series was a lot. Every book is about 700 pages, so it's definitely a hefty read, but the author does a very good job just kind of like giving an overall picture of the scene you're in, what's happening. So I think that's why it's so big. That I've been told that like this series is one of the easier fantasy series to get into because there is like romance, there's action, um, versus the other fantasy books that are probably more action based. So I feel like I would give most of these a 4 or 5, to be honest. I think ACOTAR was the only fantasy that I read this year because it was 5 books. So I really didn't have the time to get into another series because most fantasy books are long series. So I think I gave fantasy a break, and now it's about Halloween time. So I really wanted to try like a horror mystery book. So the first one I read was Hidden Picture. This was a pretty easy read because, like the title says, Hidden Pictures. The book itself actually has pictures in it throughout the book. It's about a nanny who I believe has like some issues where she like sees or hears things. So she has issues already. So she has a hard time getting a job, but she ends up getting a job as a nanny through referral from her coach. When she starts the job, it's in like a small town where everyone kind of knows each other. And so when she starts the job, she takes care of this little boy who starts drawing for her. And the more time that she spends with this boy, the more realistic the photos become and the more graphic they become. It's like sometimes you'll see like a bunny like just jumping and hopping, but then later on in the book, you see like a woman trying to like grab you or something. And so the whole book is her kind of just like going around town asking questions about this boy and like what the heck is going on. And you're also like going through these photos because like you can visually see them. And you're like, what is happening? Like, why is the boy drawing these photos? Things like that. So I think it was a fun read. I would give it maybe like a 3 just because I felt like it was kind of predictable of like what was happening, and like I actually even guessed who is behind these photos, and I was actually proud of myself for that because this is my first horror mystery book. So the second book I read in the horror genre is The Locked Room. So I've heard a lot of great things about the author. Her name is Freda McFadden. So I definitely wanted to give this book a try, and it was like free on my Kindle, so I'm like perfect timing. So it's about a woman whose dad was actually a serial killer, and he's known for is chopping the hands off his victims. Like he has a bag full of hands. And so there was this room in the house, the basement, that the girl was never allowed to go into. And his dad is always like, oh, if you hear sounds, like it's just me moving things, blah, blah, blah. And so one day I think the door was just open, and like the dad apparently purposely had it open because he wanted to see if the girl was psycho like him. Turns out she's not. And so I think when she had the chance, she was like, I think like early teens, she ends up going to the police and like putting her dad in jail. And I think the dad just never kind of got over it, and he was pretty mad about it, but he still ends up like sending her letters all the time and like trying to get her to come visit him. Later on in life, when she's like 20s or 30s, she becomes a surgeon, and a lot of people start dying, and a lot of people's hands were also severed, just like how her dad would kill the victims. So she's like, this cannot be a coincidence. And so she like calls up the jail or prison and was like, is my dad still there? And he is. So it's definitely not the dad, but it is somebody killing the person. And she, at this point, she like changes her name and everything so that like no one can connect her with the dad because he was like a famous serial killer. But when all these killings started happening, people were like, "This it must be the surgeon," because a lot of the victims were actually her patients. So she got scared and she was like, "Did I actually do this? Like, I do this in my sleep or like unconsciously?" So the whole book is just of her trying to like figure out what is going on, who is killing all these people, who's trying to frame her. And there's a twist at the end on who it is because I thought I knew who it was, but then it turns out to be somebody else, and you're gonna have to read to find out who it is. But I think like this book was, it had the potential to be predictable, but there was like again that twist to it, so I think that helped a lot. So I would give this book probably like a 4 for its theme during Halloween. I guess like that's when I read it, so um, it helped with like having that spookiness for Halloween. So, and then the books that I read towards the end of the year were slower books, more nonfiction based that maybe I'll talk about in the following year, but it's not necessarily books that I would recommend. So that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed me kind of just recapping all the books that I read. I know it wasn't everything, but it was one of the more fun books I read. So if you want to see my full list on Goodreads, follow me. I'll link it below in the bio. But until then, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe for more book content that I will hopefully share more of in the following year.